Hello everyone, today I'll be presenting on the freedom of speech as well as intellectual property rights, which I think these two rights shape almost everything we say, create, and also share online. So the first is our freedom of speech. So the freedom of speech is a right that's protected by the First Amendment, but this First Amendment right only really shields you from the government, not from all consequences of everything you're saying. So it means it's not absolute. So things you say that defame other people, that are like obscenities and fraud, is not protected by the First Amendment. So even though it's free speech, it's not really an excuse to just say whatever you want to say. We learned about intellectual property rights in Chapter 6, which protects the work that people create. These are like copyrights, patents, trademarks, as well as trade secrets. Basically, the goal is to reward creators for making things, but at the same time, this could also bring up the issue of overprotection. So with intellectual property rights, there has to be a balance in between protecting those who create and also leaving space and not blocking the very creativity we're trying to protect. So the first insight I took away from the reading was the freedom of speech and the limits that it had. I didn't really understand the limits. I knew there were consequences for what you said, but I didn't know that there were specific legal consequences. And then the next thing were IP rights. I think the most important thing in the reading with intellectual property rights was the idea of having a balance in between overprotection of these property rights and also properly protecting people who are creating new things. So comparing and contrasting freedom of speech and intellectual property rights, freedom of speech essentially protects you from the government, while intellectual property rights gives owners the weapons to use against others, sort of. One, the freedom of speech defends, while the other, IP rights, kind of attacks. Over censorship in speech really stops people from talking and speaking out against things that are wrong, while over enforcement of IP and kind of stops people from creating, and both can really be abused, but I think they're on two different sides of the spectrums. So the first article I found was evaluating the regulations of social media, and they studied Germany's NERTZ, I'm not really sure how to say NERTZ DG moderation law, and found no real evidence of mass censorship. So I think the takeaway from this was tighter moderation doesn't automatically destroy free expression and free speech. It's really more complicated than people typically think it is. So my second article was on intellectual property rights from 2004. It was called Controlling Digital Piracy via Domain Name System Blocks. Super long title, but essentially what had happened was the NS blocking really reduced piracy traffic, but it didn't really increase the legal purchases of those things that were being pirated. So my takeaway from this was that laws can change what we do because there's no way to do it around the law, but it can't really fix the motives for why people want to pirate and why people want to do those things. Next is the biblical integration. For that, I chose Ecclesiastes 4:28 to 29. First, verse 28, I think this speaks directly to intellectual property, which is like respecting someone else's work. It isn't just a legal obligation, it's something that the Bible tells us to do, so it's a moral one. And it really reflects the dignity of the person who created it. The next verse, verse 29, let no corruption talk come out of your mouth, but only such as is good for building up. I think this is really speaks a lot about how we use our free speech. The Bible doesn't just want us to talk just because we can't talk. It wants us to use our speech to build up other people. And I think the question really isn't just what am I allowed to say, is what should I say as a child of God and what should I say that would uplift someone and not drag them down. So for my personal reflection this week, it isn't something a specific moment. It's something I've really seen over a while as being a student. So in class and group settings, I usually watch people like defend harmful or mean comments or rumors and personal attacks and sometimes accusations by calling it free speech. And in those same places, like students share copyrighted materials without any like second thought, just because it's convenient and they feel okay about it. And I think this is kind of like a collision between ethics and convenience, where people use legal language as a shield for behaviors that are not really ethically condonable. And I learned that legal or right, like we discussed in previous weeks, they're not always the same thing. Like the law sets like the base and not really the ceiling for how to treat others. And we need to like step above the law and treat people better than just the bare minimum. Just to conclude everything we've spoken about today, free speech protects expression while intellectual property protects creation. And I think both need ethical restraints, not just legal ones. And freedom without responsibility becomes harmful because just because you can do something doesn't mean you always should do them. Thank you so much for listening this week. Have a nice week.